Welcome to the ParlAmericas podcast. In this episode, we explore the intersection of climate action and public policy with a focus on the importance of tailored communication strategies to engage diverse constituencies as well as address public skepticism and declining trust, with a view to strengthening sustained support for climate action. You will hear from Professor Barbara Leckie, Academic Director of Re.Climate, Center for Climate Communication and Engagement, who outlines 5 common challenges in climate communication and presents practical strategies for parliamentarians to navigate them and foster meaningful connection. This episode was recorded during the virtual meeting titled Communicating with Constituents About Climate, Dispelling Myths and Taking Action, part of the COP30 series held on December 12, 2025.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present today, and I'm really happy to be here. My examples will be all in a Canadian context, and I hope that will be okay. I think they're broadly applicable across countries, but I just wanted to note that. I'm from Re.Climate, Canada's Centre for Climate Communication and Engagement. I will first of all introduce my comments, and then we'll look at some trends, traps, and strategies related to climate communication. As we've recognized in the context of COP, the climate landscape, while there are good things, has also changed in many ways. And I think it's important to be aware of these changes so that we can communicate most effectively. To begin with, Canadians are really concerned about climate. So when you're talking to Canadians, you're talking to people who are concerned about climate and want to hear more. That's an important thing to remember. Most Canadians also turn to their governments for climate action, adaptation, and protecting climate and biodiversity. And being aware of that, I think, empowers politicians and parliamentarians to talk more about climate change. At the same time, and this is part of the changed landscape, rising costs, loss of jobs, geopolitical instability, and increased senses of precarity have really shifted people's attention. And sometimes climate can seem remote from their concerns, and misinformation only makes these issues worse. So the first thing parliamentarians can do is to ensure that climate change itself is part of the conversation they're having. Too often it doesn't get mentioned at all. Politicians have the power to direct our conversations and intervene in climate action simply by making the climate issue more important. And so stressing that climate change is real and happening, that it's caused by us, by humans. People often don't make that connection, that it's creating serious vulnerabilities and harms which impact affordability, housing, safety, food security, and so on. That it's something scientists agree on, that it's something really importantly that we can address, that there are solutions for, and that fossil fuel burning is the main cause of climate change. COP30, as has been noted, didn't even mention the deal at the end, didn't even mention fossil fuels. And it's really important to keep going back to the cause so that we can better address the problem. So we're going to look at 5 trends and 5 traps first. That relate to climate communication. These are the 5 trends. Many people have weak mental models when it comes to understanding climate change. In Canada, for example, in a recent survey this year, 49% of the respondents did not realize that burning fossil fuels like oil and gas and coal are the primary cause of climate change. And so then it's harder to tell the story and communicate about it. A rising sense of unfairness with respect to rising costs in particular. People often feel like the incentives are unfair for electrification, or they're unclear and not designed to help them. And then that aggravates the sense of unfairness. I should have noted we'll get to strategies after I go through the trends and the traps. The third point is that people shape information. In the older information landscape, we would deliver information to people, but it would be more one way. Now with social media and the rise of more action on internet spaces, there's much more reciprocity, which is both good and bad. Being aware of it's important. Declining trust. People are moving more to their peers, less to media, government, and advocacy groups, and so amplifying trust, but we'll get to that in a minute. Rising fatalism, because people feel unsafe and insecure, they often feel like they can't do anything. Next, we'll focus on the 5 trends. Some traps that communicators get into is focusing only on targets and plans. And this is often abstract and harder to understand than telling a story. Over relying on politicians, we need politicians. It's really important. They shape the public conversation. But politicians can also help to diversify who's talking about climate change and include more participants in telling that story. Burying climate is the point I mentioned before, that often climate doesn't get mentioned because there's a sense people don't want to hear about it. And so making it more prominent. Talking to the public is a real issue because we often think of the public as a monolithic entity, but really it's composed of many different segments and types of people. And recognizing that is a very important piece of communicating effectively. And then fighting with facts is a trap people get into by just throwing facts at audiences without putting them in context, and especially without attending to feelings. Feelings don't care about facts, and feelings often shape how people hear the stories we tell. So I'll now turn to 5 strategies to build better policy stories. And the overall point of all of these suggestions is that positive stories, what we get and not what we lose, and tangible results are really the most important things. So really focusing on the positive. And we've already heard that today. So focusing on people and choices, and focus on the way that climate actions concretely improve jobs, health, and security. Noting how climate and affordability are deeply interconnected, and telling stories to illustrate that point. Instead of targets, note concrete improvements that improve people's lives and that they can see in their experience. Heat pumps, it will probably be different from country to country, but more public transit, more clean energy, a healthier environment. Telling stories where people can see themselves so they understand how incentives and new clean energy programs relate to them too. And this really helps to address that sense of unfairness if people are put into the story. And choosing compelling stories over technical issues will gain more attention and actually more trust in the end. The next point is talking to people and not the public. That's that monolithic point I was mentioning before. Urban populations have really different interests than rural ones, just to give one example. And so matching one's message and conversation to the audience is really important, considering the specific interests of those groups, meeting people where they are, ensuring policies have real and tangible value to them. And very importantly, helping people to feel like they're part of the solution. So they're part of the conversation and a part of the action. Activating trusted voices. Politicians, as I was noting, can really bolster this by diversifying the messengers who communicate about climate, but can also contribute to climate literacy, helping different groups identify reliable sources. And one issue that we've come up across again and again is that sense of elite voices can't be trusted. And so putting voices that sometimes are read as non-elite into places where they're going to be communicating and listened to can be helpful there. Transparency and participation often help to counter perceived unfairness and to amplify trust. Making it visual, showing people real stories and telling news stories and with visual details, and investing, finally, the 5th point, in narratives, frames, and facts. So bringing it back to people's lives, these changes will improve lives in these concrete ways, like just noting that over and over again. Cheaper heating, better transit, safer streets, healthier air, protecting biodiversity, and so on. Instead of targets, emphasizing renewable energy as now cheaper than oil and gas, and the oil and gas harms our environment, the renewable energy improves our environment. So climate action is not a burden that makes people worse off, but rather win-win. We reduce emissions and we get better jobs, lower costs, healthier lives. This is just a quick summary of like nonpartisan language. Knowledgeable, authentic, relatable communication is what we have found is most effective. So I began by noting that the majority of Canadians are concerned about climate, and this concern is reflected worldwide. Canadians are not alone in this. But this year, there have been some changes, and I think COP30 reflected that. In a survey we did this year, there's been a decline in interest in climate action. Like, there's still a majority of people interested in climate action, but there's been a decline. There's been an increase in thinking that fossil fuels could be important for the future. There's been an increase in anxiety about climate, which I think comes at least in part from us not talking about it a bit. People want renewables, but they're still looking to fossil fuel forms of energy too. And this is a problem of communication. We have to be clear about the costs of these energies, both financially, but also environmentally and in terms of our lives. And there's also been a decline in knowledge when I was referring to those like not having adequate mental maps. People are increasingly, not by huge amounts, but noticeably not noticing that climate change is caused by human activities. So this is, again, something that we have to work on as climate communicators in terms of building those trusted relationships where you are listened to and the voice is trusted, and so that the people are less vulnerable to misinformation that's out there so much. But I just want to conclude by saying that the best way to build public support and address affordability and counter misinformation is to keep repeating and engaging with key points through positive stories, and to remember that we're in this together and that there are solutions and we can turn to those solutions.